There are secrets men keep out of fear, and there are secrets men keep because the truth is too dangerous for the world they live in. For 56 years, one Lakota warrior carried the answer to America's greatest military mystery inside him, like a bullet he could not remove. He knew who killed George Armstrong Custer. He knew because he did it with his own hands. 50 warriors claimed they killed Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 50 different men, 50 different stories, 50 different versions of the most famous death in American military history. But forensic evidence suggests only one bullet actually ended the general's life. And only one man's account contains a detail so specific, so visceral, that it could only come from someone who was face to face with the legend in the seconds before he died. He grabbed Custer's golden hair. He bit Custer's nose. He wrestled the pistol from Custer's hand. He pulled the trigger, and then he went home and said nothing for 56 years. His name was White Bull. He was 26 years old. He was the nephew of Sitting Bull, and the story he eventually told, on what he believed was his deathbed, did not sound like a legend. It sounded like a fight between two men in the dust, ugly and desperate and real. This is that story, and the reason he kept it secret tells you more about America than the killing itself ever could. George Armstrong Custer was the most famous cavalry officer in America, and he knew it. He had graduated dead last in his West Point class of 1861, which should have consigned him to obscurity. Instead, the Civil War intervened, and Custer's reckless courage, his willingness to charge when other men hesitated, rocketed him to brevet major general by the age of 23. The youngest general in the Union Army. By 1876, he was 36 years old, his golden hair flowing to his shoulders, his personality so outsized that newspapers competed to cover his exploits. The Lakota called him Pehinsksa, yellow hair, and his reputation preceded him across the plains like thunder before lightning. But Custer's fame had a darker foundation that the newspapers rarely mentioned. He had led the massacre at the Washita River in 1868, attacking a peaceful Cheyenne village at dawn and killing women and children alongside warriors. He slaughtered 800 ponies afterward to ensure no one could escape. To white America, he was a hero of westward expansion. To the Plains tribes, he was death incarnate. A man whose golden hair marked him as clearly as a rattlesnake's rattle marked the thing that would kill you. Standing against him in the summer of 1876 was a warrior whose name carried a different kind of weight. White Bull, Tatanka Ska in Lakota, was the nephew of Sitting Bull himself, the most powerful spiritual and political leader on the northern plains. At 26, White Bull had already spent 11 years on the warpath. He had fought against Crow, Shoshone, and U.S. Army forces since the age of 15. He had counted coup more times than most warriors, twice his age. He had been wounded in battle and recovered. He had led raiding parties that returned with horses and honor. He had earned the name the man who grabbed eagles for his fearlessness, a reference to the practice of capturing live eagles from their nests on cliff faces hundreds of feet above the ground, an act considered among the most dangerous tests of courage in Lakota culture. A man who would climb a cliff face to grab a living eagle with his bare hands was not a man who would hesitate when a soldier pointed a pistol at his face. While Custer sought glory and promotion, something to feed the newspapers and advance his political ambitions, White Bull fought for something more fundamental: the survival of his people's way of life. The buffalo herds that sustained the Lakota were being systematically destroyed. The government that had signed treaties guaranteeing their land had broken every one the moment gold was found beneath the soil. He fought because the alternative was to watch everything he loved disappear. The contrast between these two men tells you everything about the collision that was coming. One was fighting for a promotion and a newspaper headline. The other was fighting because the alternative was extinction. One wore his ambition on his golden hair like a flag inviting bullets. The other carried his courage quietly, the way a man carries a weapon he hopes he will not need but knows he will. They would meet face to face in the dust of a Montana hillside, on an afternoon so hot the air shimmered above the grass. And only one would walk away. The military catastrophe that brought Custer and White Bull together began with a series of decisions so reckless that military historians still shake their heads a century and a half later. Custer was offered Gatling guns for the campaign, early machine guns capable of firing 400 rounds per minute. He refused them, claiming they would slow his cavalry. He was offered additional companies from the 2nd Cavalry to reinforce his regiment. He refused those too, convinced the 7th could handle any force it encountered. Pride was not just Custer's weakness, it was his operating system. His scouts warned him the village on the Little Bighorn was enormous. The Crow scout Mitch Boyer reportedly told him it was the largest gathering of Indians he had ever seen in his life. Another scout, Bloody Knife, made the sign for too many to count. Custer dismissed the warnings. He was not worried that the warriors would fight. He was worried they would scatter before he could attack. His response to being told he was riding toward 2,000 warriors with 600 men was to ride faster. Each trooper carried a single-shot Springfield carbine and 100 rounds of ammunition. Do the math. In a sustained fight, 100 rounds lasts roughly 30 minutes. After that, a soldier with a Springfield is holding an expensive club, and the Springfields had a fatal flaw that no one in Washington had bothered to fix. The copper cartridge casings expanded in overheated barrels and jammed, turning the weapon into dead weight at exactly the moment a soldier needed it most. Against this, many warriors carried repeating rifles that could fire 15 rounds without reloading. The technological advantage that most Americans assumed favored the cavalry was, in many cases, reversed. The warriors had better weapons, and they were fighting on ground they knew the way a farmer knows his own field. Weeks before the battle, Sitting Bull had performed a sun dance, the most sacred ceremony in Lakota spiritual life. He danced until he collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss, having cut 50 pieces of flesh from each arm as an offering. In the trance that followed, he received a vision: soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp, their hats falling off. "These soldiers do not possess ears," he proclaimed. "They are to die." The entire camp took this as divine prophecy. Victory was not just possible, it was ordained. On the morning of June 25th, despite every warning and every sign, despite scouts who told him in plain language that there were more warriors in that valley than his regiment had bullets, Custer made the decision that sealed his fate. He divided his already outnumbered regiment into 3 separate groups and sent them in 3 different directions against a force that outnumbered his entire command several times over. He believed, against all evidence, that the warriors would scatter when attacked. He had built his entire tactical plan on one assumption: that the Indians would flee to protect their families. It was the assumption that had worked at the Washita. It would not work here, because these warriors were not running, they were waiting. Major Marcus Reno took approximately 140 men and charged the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen took another 125 on a scouting mission to the southwest. Custer himself took 210 men and rode north along the bluffs, planning to strike the village from the opposite end. The plan required coordination between units that could not see or communicate with each other, speed of execution against an enemy that was already mobilizing, and a small disorganized opponent that would flee rather than fight. None of these conditions existed. Reno's attack disintegrated within minutes. His 140 men charged the southern end of the village and were met by a wall of warriors that materialized with terrifying speed. Gall, the Hunkpapa war chief whose own family had been killed in the opening volley, organized a counterattack so ferocious that Reno's line buckled, broke, and dissolved into a panicked scramble back across the river. Nearly a third of his command was killed or wounded before they reached the bluffs above. The rout freed over 1,000 warriors to turn their attention elsewhere, north, toward the ridge where Custer's column was about to discover that glory and annihilation sometimes look exactly the same from a distance. While Reno fought for survival at the southern end of the village, Custer led his 5 companies north along the ridgeline. Witnesses would later testify that he paused at a high point, watching Reno's attack fail in the valley below. What happened next defied every principle of military logic. Instead of reinforcing Reno or retreating to consolidate, Custer continued north, deeper into enemy territory, apparently still believing he could find an angle of attack that would break the village open. Crazy Horse was already leading warriors through the ravines to the north and east, cutting off the route Custer would need if he tried to retreat. His force moved through the broken terrain with the confidence of men who had hunted these valleys since childhood. Every coulee, every ridge, every fold in the earth was known ground. To the warriors it was home. To the soldiers it was a maze. Gal, having shattered Reno, was now leading hundreds of warriors north along the river toward the sound of Custer's column. The jaws of a trap that Custer did not know existed were closing around him with the precision of a hunting party driving game toward a kill zone. White Bull was among those moving north. He had fought in the initial defense against Reno. Now, riding with a group of Miniconjou warriors, he was heading toward the ridgeline, where the dust cloud of Custer's column could be seen against the afternoon sky. He did not know that he was riding toward the most famous death in American history. He only knew that soldiers were on the ridge, and they needed to be stopped. What happened on that ridge in the next hour was not the heroic last stand that paintings and movies have depicted for a century and a half. It was a military collapse so rapid and so total that some historians believe the entire fight lasted less than 45 minutes. Custer's 210 men found themselves on exposed ground, with enemies emerging from every ravine and every fold in the terrain. The tactical situation deteriorated with sickening speed. Soldiers dismounted and shot their own horses, dragging the carcasses into rough barricades. The spring fields that were supposed to be their lifeline began to fail. Copper cartridge casings expanded in overheated barrels and jammed. Troopers clawed desperately at stuck rounds with their pocket knives, prying at casings that had welded themselves to the chamber walls through heat and friction. Some men broke their knives trying. Others simply dropped the useless Springfields and drew their revolvers, knowing they had 24 rounds left and 100 enemies in front of them. The weapons the United States government had issued to its frontier cavalry were failing at the worst possible moment. The warriors did not need to charge the barricades. They could fire from cover with repeating rifles while the soldiers struggled to make their single-shot weapons work. The perimeter shrank. Each man who fell created a gap that could not be filled. The dust was so thick that warriors on the same side fired on each other's shadows. The noise was beyond description. Hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, war cries in Lakota and Cheyenne, horses screaming, the crack of Springfields answered by the rapid staccato of Winchesters from every direction. Some soldiers turned their weapons on themselves rather than face what was coming. The sound of single pistol shots from inside the perimeter, spaced seconds apart, each one meaning the same thing, carried a horror that was different from the horror of combat. Others fought until their ammunition was gone, and then fought with whatever they could find. Rifle butts swung like clubs, rocks thrown at point-blank range, bare hands against men with war clubs and knives. The air was so thick with dust and smoke that the sun had dimmed to a copper disk overhead, and men could taste the gunpowder on their tongues. The discipline that had held the 7th Cavalry together through years of frontier warfare dissolved in the heat and the dust and the overwhelming numbers. The ridge Custer had chosen as a fighting position had become a killing floor with no exit. But in the chaos, individual warriors were making their way toward the center of the perimeter, toward the officers, toward the man with the golden hair, who every Lakota and Cheyenne warrior on that hillside knew by reputation. Yellow hair, Pahinsksa, the man who had burned villages and killed women and slaughtered ponies. Finding him and killing him would mean more than killing any other soldier on that ridge. It would mean ending the symbol, and one warrior was closer than any other. White Bull's account of what happened next was not recorded until 1932, 56 years after the battle, when the historian Stanley Vestal sat with the aging warrior and listened to a story that no one else had ever heard. What White Bull described was not a legend. It was a brawl. White Bull had charged into the perimeter on horseback, part of a wave of warriors that surged over the barricades of dead horses from the western slope. His pony was shot from under him mid-stride. The animal collapsed, and White Bull hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. He came up on his feet in the middle of the fighting, with dust in his mouth and blood running from a scrape on his forehead, and the sound of dying men in every direction. He had lost his rifle in the fall. He had a knife and his hands, and whatever he could take from the next man he encountered. Dust choked the air so thick he could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Bodies lay everywhere. Wounded soldiers and warriors tangled together in the dirt. And then, through the dust, he saw a soldier on the ground, not dead, still moving, still fighting. An officer with short hair and a pistol he was using. White Bull rushed him. The soldier fired. The bullet passed so close, White Bull felt the heat on his face and heard the crack of it passing his ear. A fraction of an inch between life and death. White Bull grabbed the man by the shirt and tried to wrestle him to the ground. The soldier was strong, stronger than White Bull expected from a man who had been fighting all afternoon in 90-degree heat wearing a wool uniform. He fought back with the feral desperation of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds were all he had left on Earth. What followed was hand-to-hand combat of a kind that no Hollywood film has ever accurately portrayed, because Hollywood cannot show what it actually looks like when two men try to kill each other with their hands. Two men rolling in the dust, grappling for a weapon, each trying to kill the other with bare hands and teeth, and whatever could be gripped and swung. White Bull grabbed for the pistol. The soldier twisted away with surprising strength. Both men were covered in dust so thick it caked in the sweat on their faces. The world had narrowed to a circle of dirt and blood, and the space between two bodies fighting for one weapon. Everything beyond that circle, the battle, the screaming, the gunfire, the dying horses, had ceased to exist. There was only the pistol and the hands fighting for it. White Bull struck him across the face. The soldier bit White Bull's hand so hard the teeth marks would scar permanently. White Bull bit the soldier's nose. He would later describe the taste of blood and dust and sweat in language that made Stanley Vestal physically uncomfortable. This is the detail that separates White Bull's account from every other claim. 50 warriors said they killed Custer. Many described shooting him from a distance. Some described heroic single combat. But only White Bull described biting the man's nose and tasting his blood, a detail so intimate, so ugly, so far removed from any legend anyone would want to create about themselves, that it carries the weight of truth precisely because no one would invent it. White Bull wrestled the pistol free. He struck the soldier across the temple with the barrel. The man went down. White Bull shot him, twice, once in the chest, once in the head. Then he stood up, covered in dust and blood, and moved on to the next fight. He did not stand over the body and proclaim victory. He did not take a trophy. He did not even know for certain who he had killed until later, when the fighting was over and the terrible silence had settled on the ridge, and warriors moved among the bodies, stripping weapons and identifying the dead by their uniforms and their faces. That is when someone turned the officer White Bull had killed face up in the dust and recognized him despite the short hair. The face had been in drawings. It had been described in stories that traveled from tribe to tribe. The high cheekbones, the sunburned skin, the mustache stained with blood from where White Bull had bitten through. Yellow hair, Pahinsksa, George Armstrong Custer. White Bull had killed the most famous soldier in America, in hand-to-hand combat, at the age of 26, and he told no one. The silence lasted 56 years, more than half a century of carrying the heaviest secret in American military history, and telling no one. Why? Because White Bull understood something about America that most Americans did not understand about themselves. Custer's death at the Little Bighorn became the single most powerful piece of propaganda in the history of the American West. The moment the news reached the Eastern newspapers, the narrative was fixed. Brave soldiers massacred by savages. A golden-haired hero martyred in defense of civilization. The death that proved once and for all that the Plains tribes were too dangerous to be left free. Custer's last stand became the moral justification for everything that followed. The forced marches to reservations, the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds, the kidnapping of native children and their placement in boarding schools designed to erase their language and their memory, the massacre at Wounded Knee, all of it justified by the story of a brave general killed by savages who needed to be conquered for the safety of decent white Americans. One man's death became license for cultural genocide. White Bull watched it all happen from the reservation where the government had placed his people after the victory they were not permitted to celebrate. He watched the soldiers come for Crazy Horse and heard later that the man who said little and did much had been stabbed with a bayonet in military custody. He watched his own uncle, Sitting Bull, shot dead by reservation police on a December morning in 1890. He watched the buffalo herds shrink from millions to hundreds until the animal that had been the center of Lakota life existed only in memory and in the drawings old men made on hide. And he was still alive when the 7th Cavalry, Custer's own regiment, massacred over 250 Lakota at Wounded Knee, mostly women and children, 14 years after the battle where White Bull had killed the regiment's most famous commander with his own hands. Every one of these catastrophes was justified, explicitly or implicitly, by the story of Custer's heroic death. And White Bull knew that if the truth came out, the retribution would not fall on him alone. It would fall on his people. The man who killed the legend would become the excuse for accelerating the destruction of everyone the legend had been trying to destroy. So he stayed silent. The silence was not cowardice. It was the last act of a warrior protecting his people. The same instinct that had driven him into combat at the Little Bighorn now drove him into a different kind of battle. The battle to keep a secret that could make things worse for people who had already lost everything. In 1932, Stanley Vestal, a historian and professor from the University of Oklahoma who had spent years building relationships with Lakota elders and earning trust that most white academics never achieved, was conducting interviews with surviving participants of the Little Bighorn. White Bull was in his 80s. His health was failing. The reservation years had worn him down the way water wears stone, slowly and completely. He had watched his uncle Sitting Bull shot dead. He had watched the buffalo disappear. He had watched children taken from their families and sent to schools where they were beaten for speaking Lakota. He had carried his secret through all of it, and now, believing he was approaching death, he decided that the truth deserved to outlive him. But he imposed a condition. Vestal could hear the story. Vestal could write it down, but it could not be published until after White Bull's death. The old warrior was not willing to risk the consequences for his family and his community while he was still alive. Vestal listened. He recorded details that made his academic training cringe and his human instincts recoil. The bite, the blood, the wrestling, the taste of another man's face in your mouth during a fight to the death. He was convinced. The specificity was too great. The emotional texture was too raw. No one fabricates a story that makes them look like an animal, unless they are telling the truth about a moment when survival reduced two men to exactly that. Vestal honored the request. He sat on the story for 25 years. White Bull died in 1947. The confession was finally published in 1957, a full decade after White Bull's death, and 81 years after the battle. The historical community exploded in debate that has never been fully resolved. The debate over White Bull's claim has continued for decades and will likely never be fully resolved. Scholars examining the forensic evidence found his account compelling. Custer's body was found with 2 gunshot wounds, one in the left chest, below the heart, one in the left temple. Neither wound showed powder burns from close range on the skin, but the clothing around the chest wound did show residue consistent with a shot fired from very close range, perhaps a few feet, exactly the distance at which a man wrestling a pistol free from his opponent would fire. Bullet trajectory analysis suggests he was shot while down or kneeling. This matches White Bull's description of striking the officer down and then shooting him at close range. No other claimant's account matches the forensic evidence as precisely. But here is what matters beyond ballistics. White Bull's account contains the kind of detail that truth carries and invention does not. The taste of blood, the feeling of teeth sinking into his hand, the weight of a dying man struggling beneath him, the sound of his own breathing in the seconds after the shot. These are not the details of a man constructing a legend. These are the details of a man reliving a memory that haunted him for over half a century. But certainty in the fog of battle is a luxury historians rarely possess. Other accounts place Custer's death differently. Some suggest he was wounded from distance first, then finished at close range. The dust, the confusion, the fact that Custer had cut his hair and was not immediately recognizable all complicate any definitive conclusion. Modern archaeology at the battlefield continues to chip away at mythology. Metal detectors have mapped cartridge casing patterns that show the battle lines were different from official accounts. Bullet analysis proves warriors had better weapons than previously acknowledged. Each discovery confirms what Lakota and Cheyenne oral histories had been saying for over a century. The people who were there told the truth. The people who were not there wrote the history. But here is the question that matters more than ballistics. Why does it matter who killed Custer? It matters because as long as Custer's death remains a mystery, it remains a myth. A myth can be shaped to serve any purpose. It can justify conquest. It can excuse genocide. It can transform a military disaster caused by one man's arrogance into a noble sacrifice that demanded revenge. But a specific answer kills the myth and replaces it with something far more uncomfortable. A 26-year-old Lakota warrior and a 36-year-old American general rolling in the dust, biting each other, fighting for a pistol like 2 men in a bar fight. No glory, no nobility, just survival. That image does not fit on a monument. It does not inspire patriotic speeches. It humanizes both men in ways that mythology cannot tolerate. Because mythology needs heroes and savages. It does not need 2 desperate men covered in blood and dirt fighting over a gun. White Bull carried the heaviest secret in American military history for 56 years. Not because he was ashamed, because he understood what America would do with the truth. The man who killed the legend would become the excuse for destroying the people the legend had been trying to destroy. So he stayed silent, and the silence protected his people longer than any rifle ever could. He told the truth only when death made silence unnecessary. And the truth, when it finally came, was not a confession, it was a correction. 50 warriors claimed the kill. Only one knew the taste of Custer's blood on his hands. White Bull took that visceral truth to his grave, sharing it only when death was close enough to make consequences irrelevant. In the end, perhaps that is the real mystery of the Little Bighorn. Not who killed Custer, not how many arrows were fired, or how many Springfields jammed, or which ravine the last soldiers died in. The real mystery is what it cost one man to carry the truth for 56 years, while watching the lie justify the destruction of everything he loved. White Bull did not kill a general, he killed a symbol. and the weight of that symbol was heavier than any man should have to carry alone through more than half a century of silence and loss.